reading today comes from the call of Abram. I know we're accustomed to calling him Abraham, but he is only called Abraham for this little tiny chunk of the story about him. So since he hasn't been renamed, I will be using just Abram. And then I'm going to drag you all down the enormous rabbit hole of research that I did this week. Because once I started, I couldn't stop. So this should be fun. So we are in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to a place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages towards the Negeb. So just throwing it out just before this, because this matters. So before 12 starts, where they leave from Haran, he's originally from the city called Ur. That's in the end of the verse above that. That's relevant because I'm going to talk a lot about Ur today. So we have here the call of Abram, which is often sort of touted as the beginning, really, of the specific lineage that leads to Israel and the Hebrew people. Now, the call originally begins with, "Leave the land of your fathers and your people." And I think in a world where traveling and moving around is so common, we've had how many people just go to Arizona in the last month? Where traveling around is relatively easy and people kind of spread out quite a bit. I think we kind of don't understand how big of a deal it is for Abram to move from Ur, from Mesopotamia, this area in modern Iraq, all the way over towards the edge of the Mediterranean, where he knows nobody. I mean, this is a world where family connections were everything. You survived as a unit, not as an individual or even an individual group. Your extended family was everything. And he leaves all that behind to shoot over here where starting from scratch, except what he brings with. And he brings his wife and his nephew. Now, when he does this is an interesting question, and this is what started my kind of rabbit hole here. We have a really good timeline starting at King David going forward, okay, but everything before that gets really messy. So, if we look at when Abram is leaving Ur, because he leaves from Haran, but which is just a little ways away from Ur. That's his little staging area before he caravans out on the hinterlands. We're ballparking somewhere around 2000 BCE, give or take, okay? So there's a few good reasons someone at that time might be leaving Ur. In 2154 BCE, which would be kind of on the front end of when this could be happening, these people called the Gutians, who come from the mountains, the Zagros Mountains, just to the east of Ur, come in and kind of destroy all of Mesopotamia. Boom. And a lot of people moved westward to try and kind of escape that destruction. Well, then in 1940 BCE, remember this is before, so the numbers get smaller, meaning they're closer. I don't know, no matter how much time I spend in history, I have a hard time getting used to the smaller numbers go forward. In 1940, the Elamites, which are kind of down and to the east from Mesopotamia, come in and sack everything, Ur and Babylon and all of that. And then if we go all the way on kind of the far end of this range, there's this guy named Hammurabi, if you've heard of him. He's famous for making this big law code and putting it up on a rock called a stele. Around 1800, you have Hammurabi, and right after him, he is an Amorite king of Babylon and Ur in this territory, and he ends up getting defeated in battle, and once again, the area is kind of wiped out, and a whole bunch of people move. So there's a lot of points in time in this general time frame where probably not just Abram, but a whole lot of people from Ur and Haran and this area in here are getting pushed westward. And it would make sense, therefore, that, it's not that Abram's going totally by himself. He's bringing a bunch of people with him, probably leading some kind of caravan away. Now, we're going to skip the Egypt connection. Between these dates, somewhere in this time frame where we're looking, where Abram is probably leaving, Ur is the largest city in the world. Ur has a population of almost 65,000 people. That's 0.1% of the human population of the planet at that time. A city of 65,000 people is still a pretty big city today. This is 2000 BCE. He is leaving the biggest metropolitan area the world has ever seen and going out to the middle of nowhere. Canaan, or Canaan, is largely little city-states with huge open areas in between. And as it makes clear as he goes, he makes his tent places. He's not building houses. They're nomads at this point. They're just wandering around. That's why, he makes his tent here. He sets up an altar here. He and his people are always on the move. So they're not building a new city like Ur where they come from. They are just meandering around Canaan. That is a pretty big change of life for them. Hebrew itself, the language that most of the Old Testament is written in, is a Canaanite dialect itself. So some point in this process, Abram gives up his home language of probably Akkadian and switches over to the dialect and language used. They're both Semitic languages, but they're pretty radically different. And so he becomes very much fitting into the land and the people that he is now with. So the fun thing about this, so many connections. So they leave. I'm doing everything backwards for you guys. Mesopotamia. They leave Mesopotamia and come over here to the coast of the Mediterranean, right? And right below them is this place called Egypt that I feel like most people have heard of. Now, Egypt controls a big chunk of Canaan up to like Byblos. And Egypt, at about this time, right around the Middle Kingdom, about 2000, starts referencing a nomadic people in this general region. And it's sort of a catch-all term. It doesn't refer to like a specific ethnic group or anything, but all these wandering nomads that keep causing problems for their territories up there, they refer to them as the Habiru, which conveniently sounds a whole lot like Hebrew. And so all of these nomadic Habiru that keep being a nuisance for them show up at about the same time we're looking at Abram and all of these Ur people moving in to that territory. Kind of fun. Pushing kind of beyond the other end of the story, shortly hereafter, by 1750, All right, so now we're on the back end of that range I gave. By 1750, a group of Canaanites called the Hyksos from Canaan and the surrounding area, and it's a coalition group. There are Habiru in this, it's noted by the Egyptians, come in and settle in northern Egypt and establish a small kingdom called the Hyksos. I just lost the word for it. Dynasty in northern Egypt, where they hang out for between 100 and 200 years. I don't know if that sounds like any other stories maybe that come shortly after this. Joseph into Egypt before they leave. So Abram is called to start this whole process. And the beautiful thing, we talked last Sunday about how names aren't just names. They're words in the language, right? And we know our names have meanings, but we don't often just think of our names for whatever they mean. They are literally, there is the only way to tell the difference, if you were reading this in Hebrew, between a name and just the word it is you better hope the word it is isn't another noun because it's being used as a noun. That's the only way you know that it's a name. Abram is great father, which sounds more just like a title than an actual name, if anything. This whole story bringing about the people for whom are writing this book, as they're looking back on their history and their ancestry, they all derive back to the movement of this great father that they all share. There wasn't much else bringing these people together. If you look, not even, even if you're in the middle of the Bible, if you're in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, if you're reading through that, you ever notice that they don't get along? Or even if you read Exodus, the tribes are always kind of fighting with each other as they're traveling. God constantly has to intervene because they're at each other's throats half the time. These people, for being one people, sure don't get along very well. They don't seem to have a whole lot in common. But with Abram, their great shared father, they have a man who presumably learned Canaanite or joined with the Canaanites, moved into Canaan, traveled around all of these different territories, probably picking up people as they went with his group. He's from Mesopotamia with a whole bunch of other Mesopotamians that come with him, refugees. Just after this, like literally the next chapter, he's down in Egypt for a while before coming back up. Abram becomes this beautiful, uniting figure that pulls together all of the various surrounding groups and cultures and peoples that all eventually unite to become Israel. The beautiful thing about Abram isn't just the literal story. He has a fun literal story. You are going to be a blessing. He does some weird stuff. He lies a lot about his wife being his sister. That one's kind of weird. I have a whole sermon on that we're not going to do. But the point of his story is that he becomes this point of reference so that everyone in this coalition, all of these tribes of Israel, all of the people that have kind of gathered around and moved with them and are settling with them, can unite behind this idea of, look, we all have our different ways of doing things now. We're different people now, but we all come from the same place. That place is a person who was from all of these places in some ways, but that means we can take all of this and unite it together as one. We have been sort of trained to read this story as the story of a people that starts kind of as one and then fragments over time. I think a much better lens is to look at this as a story of people who are all fragmented and start trying to look back to figure out their commonalities. Because if you jump up just before 12, when it talks about Abram and his family being from Ur, it refers to it as Ur of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans don't exist in 2000 BCE. The Chaldeans as a people don't appear at all until somewhere around 900 BCE, and don't take over Ur until somewhere around 700. Which means when this is edited together, when this book is written, when this put in the form we have, probably a bunch of existing documents, and I've talked about this before, existing stories that the scribes were like, we have too many sheets of paper, we need to cut this down and make it one. When they edit together, probably during the Babylonian exile, when they are a bunch of tribes and a bunch of people that have been stolen from their land, and they are hoping and preparing to go back to it, and they need to look at themselves again, not as a disparate bunch of tribes and peoples that were stolen, but as one united people. The story of Abraham is those people taking all of the stories that they have, all these little scraps that they had saved from the destruction of Jerusalem, and putting it together into one story that they could all share together, so that when they managed to get out and go back, they were a single, united people. That is the beauty and amazing thing about the story. When we read Abraham, when you read this old stuff, don't read it from that time looking forward. Remember, when it's being put together, they're already in the forward trying to look back, making sense of their history. And Abraham is not only beautiful because it unites them, but it reminds them that they are descended not from the imperial leaders of Ur and Babylon. They are not descended from the pharaohs of Egypt. They're not descended from the Akkadian princes or the Hittite princes. They are descended from some guy who left his home to stake a claim in the middle of nowhere by historical standards. They are united, and they're the underdogs. And if they want to maintain that, if they want to survive and thrive and be that people and live out those promised blessings, they have to remember that these are promises to a nobody who escaped destruction so long ago and joined together all of these people and places to make something new and powerful and amazing, blessed by God. That is the call of Abram. And in a lot of ways, that's what we are still called to today. In a world so full of fragmented groups and fractious peoples, we have to go back and find our commonalities. And remember that those differences between us are not nearly as important as what we have in common. Amen.